Okay, welcome everybody. Can you hear me and see my screen? Fantastic. Firstly, I just want to say welcome and thank you so much for having me. The talk today is about my PhD work. So I'm in the third year of my PhD. I'm currently trying to do lots of writing up and lots of analysing. And so what I'm sharing today is really a work in progress, and some ideas really that I hope can generate discussion. And I'm a little bit nervous because I've read lots of your work and lots of you have inspired the things that I'm doing. So I just want to say thank you for that. But the talk that I'm going to do today is about how teachers build a curriculum for their classroom and how LCT might be able to support teachers in doing it more mindfully and with mastery. So my talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about my problem space and my experience of the problem. And then I'm going to spend quite a bit of time sharing my analysis of teachers' curriculum development work, and again, how they design their practical work. And I'm going to talk about the potential that LCT has and how we could use it with some teachers to support the way that they do it. So here I've got a model by Mark Priestley, which shows different sites of activity. And it suggests that curriculum is made in 5 different sites. And when I'm discussing curriculum design or development or planning in this talk today, I'm referring to the work that teachers are doing in translating these standards, these specification, this kind of curriculum policy, and translating it into what teachers are actually using in the classroom. So I'm really interested in this microsite where teachers are designing schemes of work or sequences of lessons. My work didn't really look at the individual unit of a lesson and was more looking at sequences of lessons. So for clarity, I'm not talking about kind of designing the big national curriculum policy stuff. So what we know is that teachers and educators, they don't simply just deliver the national standards, and teachers have a huge part to play in translating the curriculum into something they use in schools and in classrooms. And the practices that teachers use can be described as relational, complex, and multi-directional. Teachers do lots of reflection and they have to make informed decisions that then reflect their different concerns and their context. And yet what we know is that when teachers are doing this really complex work, these practices are really poorly understood, under-researched and under-theorised. And what's more, when we think about lots of teacher training and professional learning, there seems to be a bit of a blind spot when it comes to what we mean by curriculum scholarship and what's required for curriculum planning. So I started teaching in 2012. And I know lots of my teacher training and all of my CPD has been based around pedagogy, has been based around activities and how to present to students and how to do classroom management without any real and I've never really had that understanding of what we mean by curriculum design. And this leaves teachers in this kind of difficult place because teachers are designing their curriculum, they're selecting knowledge, they're sequencing the knowledge. And yet lots of the decisions that they make, they're either acting on instinct or they're based on trial and error, or they're based on kind of experience that's been accumulated over a long, long period of time. And this was definitely the case for me. So as a teacher at a school in Doncaster, I was asked to design sequences of lessons. I'm a science teacher. And then I became head of science there, and my team, I had other teachers designing sequences of lessons. And so as teachers, we are designers of these sequences of lessons. The curriculum that I was working with was a thematic problem-based learning curriculum, where I had to start with the subject standards in science and think carefully about what I selected and what I sequenced, then think about how I integrated science with history and made it cross curricular, and then had to kind of review my own subject boundaries again, think, did students really learn what I wanted them to in science? But the problem that I experienced was I was learning about curriculum design on the job. I was learning by watching others do it in this kind of apprenticeship model. And yet, when I was talking to teachers about how they did it, they didn't really have a language that they could use and articulate what they were doing. They couldn't justify the decisions they were making in a way that made sense to me. And so it's really hard to build this knowledge base about what I was trying to do when I was designing curriculum and what I wanted the teachers in my department to do. We just didn't have a language for doing this. So I became really curious about the process of creating successful curriculum that teachers were involved in and that teachers then used, and the professional knowledge needed to do this. And so I remember one moment, I guess my introduction to LCT, I was sat in school, I was quite deflated because I was having real challenges trying to design the curriculum and articulate what I wanted to do. And Richard Pountney, who's here today, and now my PhD supervisor, he came and sat with me, and I just said to Richard, look, I don't know what I'm doing. I can't design this curriculum the way I want it. I've got all these problems, but I don't have a language for expressing that. And what Richard did, he just got a scrap of paper and he just did a tiny little wave on the page. And he said, what I think you're saying, Robbie, is this. What I think you mean is this. And that, to me, it just kind of unlocked this way of thinking, this language that then meant Richard and I could start talking about curriculum. And that enabled me to really understand the problems that I was having. And so I guess I'm very biased, but to me, that first step into LCT was really illuminated kind of some of the decisions that I were making and made visible to me some really important curriculum design practices. So I just thought I'd just stop for a moment and just reflect on whether you've got experience of this kind of problem. I wonder whether I'm sure lots of you have designed your modules that you teach at universities, or you're working with teachers yourselves, whether you've selected and sequenced the curriculum that you teach. And I'm wondering really, how did you know what to do? What forms of knowledge did you draw on? And how did you learn to do it? And again, if anybody would like to share, that would be fantastic.
Robbie, so let me start. I was involved in quite an interesting study of curriculum of different teacher education institutions in South Africa. It was called the Initial Teacher Education Research Project. And it was so interesting because we analyzed the curriculum from first year right up to fourth year, and then the 1 year PGCE over a whole lot of institutions. Some of them started with like lecture 1, express your philosophy of teaching, and then the students were held to it for the whole, for the next 4 years. Others were, no, this is something that you can only really do much later in your career. Some of them started with, let's understand the children's needs and, how do we be inclusive? And so the students would go into the schools, they could they could identify barriers of learning or so on, but then they didn't have the content or the pedagogical knowledge or of how to respond. Others start with the content knowledge and so on, and the pedagogic knowledge to teach that content, and only get to the kind of the barriers of learning later. So we saw different underlying principles of how different institutions created pathways, from kind of the the beginner to more expert ways of understanding. But I think that that's what I came to understand as a curriculum, is a kind of a pathway of learning that you create through a complex field. And there can be different underlying principles in terms of what route you take according to the priorities, and what the way you see that cumulative pathway developing.
Yeah,
So
thank you.
that was one experience.
Thank you. So I guess what you're saying is that these different institutions design their curriculum in different ways, starting at different points. Were you able to ask teachers, or sorry, the institutions, why they designed it in the way that they did?
Yeah, we did do those interviews as well, and I think that it was very much informed by the idea that either you take the right kind of knower and then you train them to do this, or you're training somebody to be a reasoning, thinking practitioner, and then what drives the logic? Is it kind of, in South Africa, principles of inclusion are huge, given our apartheid history, and also the content knowledge and what's appropriate to the subject is also huge. And there's a tension, what do you put first? What do you need to master at a basic level so that you can engage in more complex levels later? And sometimes it's iterative. So, it was just interesting to see those how their conception of the practice, in this case it was learning to teach, was enacted in those curriculum designs.
Yeah, thank you, Lee.
Can I just point out that Paul's also got his hand raised?
Yeah.
Paul.
Hi. Yeah, I mean, I was just going to say some of my practical experience. So one of the things, I mean, I'm not really sure how I know how to do it, but I think it's sort of been kind of apprenticed. So I've only done sequences over multiple lessons, or sort of mainly at university. I've done some stuff in schools as well, but generally I started by working from other people's modules where I maybe was given the chance to, well, my first experience was I was given a chance to take somebody else's module, and I taught the lecture course more or less exactly as they did, except I changed one lecture that I thought something was missing, and so I added to what was there that was just tucking something in. But that sort of then has encompassed the way I've done it over the next 20 years of it's always been iterative, that I reflect every year and I change and I tweak. So I don't expect to get it right first time. I get something that's about right, and usually I'm starting with whatever's gone before, but then every year I learn from what did or didn't go right the year before, and then you tweak it and you move things around, or you realize, oh, actually this is missing, and so this would be better here. And so for me it's a completely iterative, reflective process that I don't expect to get it right for the first 3 or 4 years, and then when I know what the problem is, then I'm gradually, I hope, getting better at it, and things change. So you kind of change what you're teaching as you go along and how you're teaching it. In terms of things that I was told, I went on a how to lecture course right at the beginning, and this was in Cambridge, and I completely disagree with one of the things that I remember from it, and the other I kind of agree with. So one of the things they said is never do the same course for more than 3 years. And as I just said, I don't think I even know how to do it until at least 3 years in. So that's totally wrong, I think. They said, by then you're jaded, pass it on to somebody else. But the other thing that they said is don't leave all the hard stuff to the end. Don't think you start easy and gradually get harder, because you need something at the beginning. So this is about sequencing. You need something at the beginning to challenge the better people, the ones who've got some experience already or know what they're talking about. So start with something hard, because the other thing is you need hard things at the beginning, because they're the ones that everybody needs more time to get their head around. And if you leave them till the last lesson, then nobody will ever get a chance to learn it. And how you do that is really difficult. But I think I always felt that was an important thing that I've then tried to do, and pushed some of the harder stuff to the beginning and keep coming back to it. So, I mean, that's just my general practical experience about some of this.
Thank you, Paul. Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on that, because I can definitely, that idea of learning from examples and learning from other people's curriculum, it really kind of resonates with me. And I remember looking at these really well-designed curriculum, but not always really knowing why they've made the decisions that they've made. Why have they sequenced it in that way? What are the underlying principles of that curriculum design? So even if I looked at it and I was like, oh, this is amazing, I still wasn't always sure about what it is that they've done that made it amazing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Those underlying principles were sometimes invisible unless I'd, as you say, taught it a number of times and reflected on it.
One of the other things actually about how I've always designed things is you start with the learning outcomes, and also the syllabus. Well, assuming there's sort of some outline syllabus that you've been given, which is usually just a bullet point list, and then I kind of from there I go to how am I going to assess it, and I get to the sort of content and the order of the content after I've decided how I'm going to assess it, and how you kind of assess things through kind of relates whether that's formative or summative, but that kind of helps you design the sequencing and what you actually select to teach as well. And the other thing is you can't actually actively teach everything. So there's a mixture at university, at least, in the things you talk about and give them explicitly to do versus the things that are there that they can work out for themselves. If they're interested enough to do the further reading or whatever, they can read around the subject. So there's this core that you have to decide what is the core that everybody's got to get, and that's the stuff that you focus on, and that's the thing that you kind of then sequence. But then you try and build this mass around it that people who find that straightforward or interested to do more, they'll go and work out the rest. And that's especially so in programming, which is what I've mainly been teaching for most of my life, that there's this core concepts, but if you get those core concepts, the rest's sort of easy. You can work it out for yourself. So that's what I have to teach. And you can pare down what you teach explicitly to a very sort of smaller subset, because they can work the rest out for themselves, is the idea. But that's one of the principles I've kind of followed.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Paul. Thanks, Lee. I'm going to keep moving forward. So in my research, I developed these research aims. Now in my school group and in lots of schools in England, we're talking about this idea of active learning in science. But the two research aims I really want to focus on in today's talk is this: understanding what constitutes the professional knowledge base required for curriculum design or development, and really to develop a model to support teachers' curriculum design practices or their curriculum thinking practices. And this was so important to me because I wanted my PhD work to be practical. I wanted it to help me. I wanted it to help the teachers in my school. I wanted teachers to be able to design the curriculum more mindfully and with mastery. So that's what I was really aiming to do in this study. So I used a social realist approach with a depth ontology so that I could go beyond just kind of describing what teachers were doing and really get at the basis of practice to understand why they were doing things, why they were making the decisions that they were doing. I used an instrumental case study approach. So I went into 5 different schools and spoke to teachers. I interviewed them. I looked at their curriculum documents. And it was instrumental in a way because the 5 schools that I spoke to and the way that teachers there developed their curriculum, it's not generalizable. It's not the way all schools made their science curriculum or translated the standards into what they teach in the classroom. But that wasn't the point of this study. The point was to kind of develop this model to help teachers think about curriculum design more mindfully. And then, so therefore, LCT was hugely useful to me in developing these models. So the first tool that I used was the specialization plane and specialization dimension, which conceives practices as knowledge structures and whose organizing principles can be explored in terms of epistemic and social relations, where the epistemic relations kind of referred to design practices that emphasized knowledge, and the social relations referred to curriculum design practices that emphasized the knower. So emphasized students' engagement with science, who they were as scientists, how engaged they were, how much they enjoyed science. So what I suggested was, by kind of mapping out different forms of science curriculum on the specialization plane, we could have a knowledge-led science curriculum where we've got this stronger epistemic relations and weaker social relations. So really the focus is there on the students learning the science knowledge. Is it sequenced correctly? There's the emphasis. Or this knower-led science curriculum where teachers were designing it for engagement, making science really relevant to them, and making sure students felt like they were interested and engaged in it. And I guess my work before all this kind of curriculum design stuff was around this idea of active learning. And I suggested that although active learning, teachers thought about it in different ways, there was a really clear knowledge component to it, and that for active learning in science to be effective, that we had to make sure pupils were thinking about the knowledge and the knowledge was emphasized. But also we wanted students to be engaged and feel like science is relevant. So I said this active learning had this stronger epistemic and stronger social relations. I developed this translation device to help me code my interviews, where a knowledge code emphasized curriculum design principles, which kind of emphasized science specialist knowledge and the principles and the procedures of science, where design principles on a knower code were kind of around developing students' qualities, their attitudes, their disposition, and their engagement in science. An elite code, the design principles would emphasize both, and a relativist code would emphasize neither.
Sorry, Robbie.
Yeah.
Can you go back one step? Thank you. So when you are talking about a knower code dominating a science curriculum, are you talking about students like putting emphasis on, careful observation, analytical ways of thinking, those sort of things? Or are you talking about kind of connecting with the students' natural dispositions, if one can call them that, or interests, and so on? I'm just trying to, I'm looking, are you looking at the knower of science, or the students as people who are learning science? I don't know if there's, if the distinction's clear.
Yeah, so for this part, I was looking at the designing for who the students were, so that their attitudes and how they felt, their dispositions. And then I think what you're referring to is this idea of kind of how science works, the observations, and that, I guess, comes at, to me, I analysed that a bit later. So I thought that this idea of students designing hypotheses and making predictions and observations was a form of knowledge.
Right.
So I kind of unpacked this a bit later
So can I just give an example, which just to see if I'm on the right track? We did it at a round table, I think 2 years ago, where a person teaching evolution had to first unpack the students' cultural assumptions and of evolutions, and you know, how they work with that at home, especially in you know, in terms of their religious beliefs or their cultural beliefs and so on, before she actually moved on to the knowledge. Is that more like what you're referring to here?
So that
Thank
could
you.
be a curriculum design principle, yeah, where
Okay.
it has its emphasis on a NOAA code, yes.
Thanks so much.
No worries. So what I did, I used this tool to analyze ideas at interview, and I've got suggested different codes for the schools that I went to. So school 1, I suggested had a stronger knowledge code, because when they talked to me about their design principles, they talked about, oh, we designed science in Key Stage 3 by selecting the foundational building blocks that are going to be the most important steps for students learning science in Key Stage 4. So really they were talking about the decisions that they were making were based around an emphasis on knowledge, on selecting the right knowledge, on sequencing the right knowledge. Whereas school 2, when I spoke to them, I suggested they had a more stronger elite code, because teachers were talking about students having enjoyable curriculum experiences, having fun practical work, being engaged, having science relevant to them, talking about where science is in their real world, but also having things bound by knowledge. So I suggested that the 5 schools I went to could be mapped onto the specialisation plan. And I mapped them like this, following analysis of curriculum documents. And these are relative strengths, and it's not an exact science. But the 5 schools that I went to, their design principles suggested a focus on knowledge, so stronger epistemic relations. So teachers often talk to me about selecting the right knowledge and sequencing the right knowledge in a hierarchical way, so that students could learn science in kind of one thing building on the next. And 2 schools also emphasize the social relations. So 2 schools, like you're kind of alluding to, they talk to me about where science in their world, and making that really important and having students engaged in that discussion. So I kind of consider that this would be helpful to me as a researcher in understanding where teachers' practices were, but also perhaps some form of this might be helpful for teachers, so they could look at their curriculum and think, this is where I am at the moment, this is what I would like it to be. But what I really wanted to do, I wanted to take this further, and I wanted a model which would support teachers' curriculum thinking, their decisions, their design practices, and so I needed to go into a bit more depth. So what I did is I asked teachers how they designed the curriculum, what principles they used. So earlier you said, Lee, when you talked about the institutions, you said sometimes they design their teacher learning programs based on this principle of inclusion, and that being quite important. Well, the teachers that I spoke to said there's these kind of 6 principles that came up. So I'm not suggesting these 6 principles along the top are all the principles that could possibly be used in curriculum design. These are just the ones that teachers that I chose, the schools that I went to, spoke to me about at interview and from the curriculum. And the 5 schools can be seen which curriculum principles they talked to me about. So all the schools I went to, they talked to me about threshold concepts. If they didn't use the language of threshold concepts, they had some idea of it. And they talked to me about the foundational concepts which kind of support future learning in science. 2 schools talked to me about this idea of a curriculum narrative, this kind of narrative for learning across a number of lessons, which learning builds in kind of a schema over time. and I'm going to unpack some ideas of curriculum narrative later on. Teachers talk to me about big ideas, and these are quite specialised in science, and they're developed by Wynne Harlan, and these are kind of general abstract ideas which connect concepts. Teachers talk to me about big questions, and these were student-friendly questions which existed over a sequence of lessons, and these were so that students had something to kind of hang their knowledge onto, so that it would help with their learning. Some teachers used cross-curriculum links to connect subjects across the curriculum and help deepen learning that way. And some teachers talked about the idea of a science capital teaching approach. This is an approach developed by Louise Archer, which builds on Budger's notion of capital, and it really emphasizes experiences in the science classroom and in the science curriculum, and connecting science and connecting the real world with some of the science that students were learning. So as I say, this isn't a comprehensive list of principles, but this kind of helped me unpack further some things that could be used. And what I
So
did
Robbie,
is,
can I just ask, these are things that teachers have said? Yeah. So they're not the curriculum development principles. They're not the curriculum development principles used by teachers. They're the curriculum development principles mentioned by teachers.
Yeah, they're the ones, when I said, how do you design your curriculum? This is what, these are the things that they said they use.
Just want to be careful that it doesn't mean, if
things
somebody
that
says they use a science capital approach, it doesn't mean they use a science capital approach. It means that they know the word science capital approach and they've decided to apply that to what they're talking about. I just want to, like, it's just really, with your study, it's going to be really key that you just like make these, it sounds a bit finicky, but it's the sort of thing that a reviewer or an examiner or something can pick up on, which is to say, actually, you have no data on what they've used. What you have is data on what they've said. And that's just, those small words will keep you from falling into a large hole if you just get used to saying that. Because what people say they do, it's not what people do necessarily. So just yeah, it's a small point, but it's one of those things where I can see a hole in the ground ahead that someone will try and trap you in if you don't watch out.
Yeah, thank you, Carl. Yeah, so just to build on that. So when I spoke to teachers about their curriculum design and their intended design, I didn't then go and observe the lessons and the sequence of learning after. So I couldn't follow up and check and say, yes, they did use this. So this was about, what teachers said they used.
Robbie?
Yeah.
Sorry, I've also got a question. Did you ask them about kind of designing curriculum generally, or did you ask them about designing curriculum of how they teach electricity or how they teach a particular topic? And if so, was that the same topic over all 5 schools, or was it more just kind of general about their general approach to science? Yeah,
so I asked teachers to give me an example and talk to me about one that they chose. So they didn't talk to me about the same example. I'm going to share a couple of examples coming up, particularly related to this idea of a curriculum narrative, a sequence of lessons. So some teachers all talked to me about Key Stage 3 science, but they chose different examples based on their specialism. And I guess what they could describe best, I guess. So
Robbie, can I ask you at this stage, had you looked at, were you taking account of the curriculum documents that they shared with you, which of course is in the English context is set by the National Curriculum for Science. So at this stage, were you taking account of their curriculum documents, and if so, which curriculum documents did you have access to?
Yeah, so again, this was an interesting one, because when I said to teachers, well, what's your curriculum planning look like? Obviously, different teachers and different schools have different curriculum planning. Teachers' schemes of work and the way teachers design sequence of lessons will look different in every school. So what I asked teachers was to share with me what curriculum planning meant to them, what a sequence of lessons meant to them. So often what I got was quite similar. It was about, this is the content I'm selecting, this is my sequence, this is my pacing, this is how long I'll spend on each topic. these are some potential activities, these are some practicals, these are some field work or trips I might go on. That's the kind of thing teachers would share with me. But again, there wasn't one identical template that teachers shared with me. Paul?
Can I just go back to your answer to Cole, this thing about observation? I mean, you said you didn't watch any lessons. Would that actually get at the principles anyway? Because if you're interested in the principles and how they curriculum plan, what you would need to observe is somebody planning something they're going to do in the future, and then perhaps observe what they do to see if they did what they planned or something else. But I mean, I just wonder to what extent actually watching somebody's lessons, how much would you get of how they planned and what the principles? Because you already said when you were answering me that principles themselves are invisible, and you can see something that looks brilliant, but you can't get the principles. So do you think having talked to them and then watched, you would actually be able to see how the principles had applied in practice, or would you actually need to observe them planning in the first place?
Yeah, so that, I guess that is part of the reason why I chose not to observe lessons, because it wouldn't make visible some of the design practices that teachers used and the decisions that teachers made. I wouldn't be able to see them by observing a lesson. Was my
what you could get if you observe them and then you question them about what you'd observe, perhaps. So like the threshold concepts principle, you might be able to sort of spot, oh, they seem to be teaching something explicitly that's a threshold concept, but then kind of asking them afterwards, so why were you teaching, well, in my case, sort of sequences of assignments? And then if they were saying, well, I did that and I gave them that test because it's a threshold concept, and I wanted them to pick up the people who had got stumbled about it. So you might be able to do it with a combination of observing and then interviewing them after the observation about what you'd observed to kind of understand it. Or what we do in HCI is you video something and then you get them to think aloud about why they were doing particular things that, so it's not necessarily you just questioning them, but you get them to watch what they did and then ask them to explain what they did.
Yeah, interesting. Thank you, Paul.
Whether that would get at principles or not, I
don't. Yeah. Thank you.
By the way, Robbie, none of that's a criticism. It's just like people trying to figure out the best way of pitching exactly what you did look at. So
yeah, no, it is interesting, and it's I guess I could have probably done it in a number of different ways. So yeah, I guess what was
the main thing is Cole's point that you just don't overclaim, which is if you claim you know what people do, then you've got to have done something else to have found it out, whereas what you can claim is what people say they did. It doesn't really matter which of those you've done, as long as you don't claim you've done one when you did the other.
Great.
But yeah, I mean, I'm just getting at this because it's just interesting of how on earth you would kind of work it out, what they actually did in a solid, rigorous way.
Thank you. So I guess when teachers said they use threshold concepts, again, I wanted to unpack that deeper and say, okay, so why do you think threshold concepts would help you? Why were they important in your curriculum design? And what teachers said to me, they kind of said, yeah, they're really important because they help me think about what knowledge to select and focus on and return to. They help me sequence my knowledge and the way that I design curriculum. So what I kind of went on to do was suggest that these different principles were used for different reasons, and that when teachers said they used threshold concepts, most of the time they said they used them to try and strengthen the epistemic relations, to try and make their curriculum have a stronger focus on knowledge. It was quite interesting when I spoke to teachers about when they said they used a curriculum narrative, And then I asked them why they used a curriculum narrative. Teachers said they used it for two reasons. They said a curriculum narrative could strengthen epistemic relations by helping knowledge build in a certain way, but a curriculum narrative could also help social relations by making students engage better with the story of science and make it more relevant to them. So I suggest that by talking to teachers about some of these principles and why they used them, that they could have different effects. I'm going to share an example. So school
Can
three.
I just ask one other quick question?
Go for it.
Which I've never sorted out myself about LCT with this. So you're talking about knowledge. Where does skills come into this? Because
yeah, really good
I would use threshold concepts to help give people skills. You know, it's partly knowledge, but it's also getting you over a barrier that opens up the ability to gain a skill.
Yeah.
So are skills part of who somebody is, or are they part of the knowledge?
So I've suggested that they're part of the knowledge, and I might skip forward a little bit to come onto that, because I think that's something that I think as Lee's raised in a similar way, that's quite an interesting thing in science, that we've got this idea of science concepts we want students to learn, but we also want students to learn skills of science, of using specialist equipment, of collecting data and making predictions. So I might skip forward a little bit to make sure we get onto that. But what I'm suggesting here is that when I spoke to teachers, they said they wanted a curriculum that was around knowledge and around students being activists and about the science curriculum being relevant and connected. And when I unpacked that with them, they said that they used a number of different curriculum principles to try and strengthen the emphasis on knowledge or strengthen the emphasis on the knower. And so teachers said, yeah, I'll use threshold concepts to kind of strengthen the focus on knowledge. I'll use the exam spec, I'll use big ideas, and that'll make sure my curriculum has this knowledge focus. But I want to make cross-curriculum links. I want experiences and big questions, and that'll help students. That will kind of give an emphasis on the knower and help students relate to what I'm doing.
Robbie?
Yes.
I was actually interested whether there were shifts between knowledge and knower codes, or whether they were all doing all of that simultaneously.
Interesting. Okay, so I guess the different principles had different emphases and different emphasis. So when teachers, they'd start off talking about threshold concepts, and then they say, oh, I also did this, and then I also did this. So I think teachers, they went back and forth most of the time between the knowledge and the knower. If they were in this situation, they were aiming for this intended curriculum that had stronger both social relations and stronger epistemic. I did come up with, some teachers did talk to me about their curriculum problems though. I'll just fast forward to that because I think it answers your question. So when this school talked to me about this intended curriculum design, they said they come across two problems. And they said sometimes when they design the curriculum, it's got too strong a focus on the kind of social relations. It's too strongly focused on this idea of students being activists and the curriculum being relevant. And they said it lacked subject integrity. So it lacked a focus on knowledge. And other times teachers talked to me about their curriculum and said, you know, I've got this strong knowledge curriculum where knowledge is sequenced, but it really lacks a stronger social relations. It doesn't help students think about science being engaging or relevant to them. And they talked to me about these problems. And so I suggest we've got these two kind of shifts that might be able to happen, that if we've got this kind of weaker epistemic relations curriculum where it's thematic, how would we strengthen the epistemic relations? How would teachers make those decisions? Teachers may decide, threshold concepts might, if I use that, it might help strengthen it and move towards where I want it to be. Or they might decide, if I've got this really knowledge heavy focused curriculum, okay, I want to change my curriculum and make it a bit more relevant to students, how do I do that? What principles are there? And they may decide to use something like a science capital teaching approach, or they might want to use big questions to make it more relatable to students. So I thought that was quite an interesting example of how LCT and mapping out the different ways we can think about curriculum might help teachers think about some of the problems that they have, and again, some of the ways that they could get towards what they want, their intended curriculum design.
Robbie, can I just come in on that as well? Because I think I'll have to sort of think as I speak, because I had a similar question to Lee, and in terms of what I think Lee was getting at. So we're sort of switching dimensions a little bit, because I struggle with elite coding. So how do you know that the curriculum, or the intended curriculum, is elite code, rather than it being a movement between the knowledge and the knowing? So a sort of a semantic wave, as it were, from conceptual knowledge to then contextualizing that conceptual knowledge and making it relevant to the students. So that might be real world examples, that might be a little bit of a case study, that might be asking students to relate it to their own personal lives. So you could see that as a knowledge-oriented curriculum with waves down to contextualization, rather than it being an elite code per se, where the driving curriculum principle is actually both. And I'm problematizing that because it's something that I'm struggling with myself at the moment, as well. Like, what's the difference? What's the difference between an elite code curriculum and a curriculum that simply moves between those two different forms of knowledge? Other people may have views. Carl may be able to come in and sort of differentiate for us as to what an elite code curriculum actually looks like and is differentiated from those moves. But yeah, are you able to see that difference?
Thanks for the question. It's a fantastic question, and I don't have the answer, and it's not something that I've thought about, but I think it's a brilliant question. If anybody wants to add in, that would be fantastic.
I will, actually, if that's okay. I do agree with the coding that you've got there. My background is also in science, and if we think about the curriculum as a unit and the outcome of the curriculum, so the things that we want students to know and be able to do and embody and all of that, if there are values expressed within that intended curriculum alongside those knowledge outcomes, then I would say it is an elite code, because both are coexisting as outcomes of that curriculum. I think you can look at it in different ways. I think definitely you can look at how those things change across the curriculum, but I see this as we've identified the curriculum as a unit, and so we consider what the curriculum achieves or what its objectives are as part of that. And if both are coexisting, then I would actually classify that as elite, because you can just have knowledge on its own and you can just have values on its own, but they're together in this intended curriculum.
Can I paraphrase that, or come back to you and just clarify if I understand what you said there? So I think my understanding of what you said is that possibly this idea is that we've got the curriculum intended outcomes, and they could be different to the way that the curriculum is delivered. So the pedagogy of using semantics, and we've got a difference there, which then talks about whether it's an elite code or whether it's switching and using semantics. So I don't know if I've expressed myself very well there. Is that what you meant?
Are you speaking to me or Steve?
Either.
No, that's it. I didn't need a response. I was probably responding more to Steve and Lee's questions. But yeah, thank you. Probably you could continue.
Great, thank you. Okay, so what I wanted to do, I wanted to try and explore some of these principles further. So for example, a curriculum narrative and how how teachers design a narrative over a sequence of lessons. And I thought semantic gravity here in particular would be really helpful to me. The degree to which meaning is dependent on context. And having this stronger semantic gravity, this really context dependent, these context dependent ideas in the curriculum, or the context independent. And so I asked teachers to talk to me about a curriculum narrative that they taught or designed or said they did over a sequence of lessons. And one teacher talked to me about this chemistry unit called Chemistry of the Atmosphere. And he said, Robbie, there's three main topics of interest. We want students to know about the evolution of the atmosphere and some of the processes and the changes in gases that happen right up until the modern day. And he said, we also want students to know about climate change, the issues and the solutions. And we also want students to know about the pollution and the effect humans have. And so I suggested that some of these ways could be thought about using semantic gravity, and that the evolution in the atmosphere is relatively more abstract, more context independent. So when we think about the issues of climate change, the solutions, and the way humans mitigate pollution. And what the teacher said to me is, they said, Robbie, traditionally we teach the topic ABC. And this is kind of the way a science specialist would think about it. They'd think about it 4 billion years ago, the start of the atmosphere, the start of what the Earth was like, and think about how it's changed up to the present day. And so they said, really, traditionally, the topic in science would be taught like this, with weaker semantic gravity, so more context independent, the idea of evolution of the atmosphere. And over the sequence of lessons, over the unit, it would gradually get more concrete, where we'd start talking about climate change and the ways humans mitigated pollution. And the teacher said to me, well, why don't we do something instead? Why don't we flip it? And instead of beginning with the atmosphere, and instead what we could do, we could start with what students know about this modern atmosphere. We could start with pollution, we could start with climate issues and work backwards. And so they said we could start with this idea of, at the moment, we've got climate problems and global warming and energy problems and food problems. If we go shopping, we could talk to students about that. And this is, I considered, more context dependent. And then we could work backwards, thinking about what the modern day atmosphere is like, and then working further backwards to say, was it always like this? No, it wasn't. The atmosphere has changed over time because of these processes. So what I'm suggesting here is that this teacher considered flipping the narrative. And instead of starting with the more abstract and the more context independent, here they started with the more concrete, started talking about issues of climate change that students can see, that's relevant, and the concrete examples of pollution and how humans mitigate them.
Robbie, can I just ask for clarity? So this was part of your research-oriented interviews?
Yes, yeah. So I asked them to talk to me specifically about an example of a unit that they've been teaching.
And were you bringing in the semantic gravity way or the semantic wave explicitly as a tool to make that visible, or is that your overlaying for us now?
Yeah, so this is my overlaying now, my analysis of the way they described it to me.
So the flip that the teacher came up with, that was just sort of reflection during the conversation as you kind of probed?
No, so I asked the teacher how they may have taught it in the past and how they might have changed it recently, or what they might do or how they could do it differently. Or I said to a teacher, have you changed the way you've taught a sequence of learning recently? And this is what they said to me.
Okay, thank you.
Again, so I asked a very similar question to another teacher, and they talked to me about a physics unit that they taught, radioactivity. And this teacher said, you know, radioactivity, it's really difficult, it's really abstract. It's these kind of tiny changes in the nucleus that have a massive impact externally in the real world. And so they say traditionally when we teach this topic, we start with the structure of the atom, we start with nuclear decay. And these are quite context independent ideas to start with for students. But then as the unit goes on, we get bigger and bigger, and it kind of, we start thinking about what radiation looks like in the real world, and what the uses of radiation are. So again, this teacher is really talking about this kind of science narrative, this sequence of learning as being starting with the context independent, and over a series of lessons making it more concrete. And this time this teacher said to me, well, actually, I do it differently now. The way that I do it now is I start with the more concrete, the more context dependent, and then I zoom into the atom, and then I zoom back out again to the kind of real world stuff. And so, Steve, this is what they said to me. They said, we start with thinking about how radioactivity was discovered, or where do we see radioactivity in the real world? What does it look like? What does dose look like? What's background radiation look like? So to me, again, my overlay of semantics is suggesting that this is more context dependent. And then they zoom in onto the atomic scale of the atom, to the abstract. And then they zoom back out again to this bigger picture of how kind of we can apply ideas of radioactivity in medicine. So this teacher really is suggesting that when they've changed the narrative, they've started with the more context dependent, they've used these upshifts, taking students to the more abstract, the ideas of structure of the atom and nuclear decay, and then they bring students back down again to uses of radiation and medicine.
So Robbie, what I'm finding interesting here is the way that you are saying that the actual topics, the content has more or weaker or stronger semantic gravity, and those can be arranged as a semantic wave. But I'm sure that within every topic, the teacher will be waving between the concepts and the principles of those topics, and then the kind of the examples that they're using or the ways that it's manifesting. But so it's really like kind of zooming out into a kind of a macro level of sequencing the topics, the content topics in themselves are also in a semantic wave.
Yeah, exactly. So yeah, and lots of people here I'm sure have looked at semantic waves within a lesson as being the unit and moving up and down. And yeah, this is reflecting on over a sequence of lessons. And what I wonder is, a very tentative suggestion, that the traditional way we teach science is that we tend over a sequence of lessons to start with the more abstract and move down to the concrete. So when I think about the cells topic, we start with cells, these tiny things, and then we go cells, tissues, organs, where organs, the heart, the lungs, it's a lot more context dependent to kids. It's less abstract. We could get a heart out and dissect it and look at it. But we don't do that. We start with cells and we go that way. Or with atoms in chemistry, we start with atoms and the structure of the atom and the electrons. And then we work towards properties and the way that these different elements react. But that's visible to kids. Kids can see the properties. We can talk about that. We could feel them. We could see them reacting. So perhaps there's potential there for flipping it the other way around. And what I suggest is in science, when we do this starting with the abstract and move into the concrete, it leaves the curriculum without any explicit upshifts. And I wonder that by flipping it, we might help sometimes students' knowledge building, because what it'll do, it'll make the upshifts more explicit across a number of lessons, and it'll enable students to start the unit with stronger, kind of having it more relevant to them, starting with them with the more concrete examples and the close to context. So again, I'm just wondering really the value of LCT in terms of helping teachers think about their curriculum design and where the upshifts are across a series of lessons, and whether a wave could be really valuable. I'm going to move on to practical work, because practical work is a really important signature element of the science curriculum. And I think it'll speak to some of the questions I think Paul had earlier about this difference between knowledge and skills. So when I spoke to teachers about how do they design their practical work, they said that they design it with a focus on knowledge, that the purpose of practical work is to teach kids knowledge. And that was quite interesting in itself, because 20 years ago, when we were talking about practical work, and there's lots of work being done about what effective practical work means, people would have been talking about, we do practical work to get kids doing hands-on stuff, to get kids doing, to get kids engaged. Whereas the teachers I spoke to said, no, practical work is for teaching students knowledge. The problem was, I'm not sure that this really went far enough using the semantic plane, because what it didn't do is it didn't kind of make the distinction between different types of knowledge that practical work was teaching. It didn't make the distinction between whether students were learning the science concepts or whether students were learning the science skills like observation, things like that. And one teacher said, we can when we plan, we can do it to help students learn observation, but we can do practical work to help students learn the theory. And so I suggest the specialization plane doesn't quite make this distinction between building knowledge of science concepts or the substantive knowledge and practical work which builds knowledge of procedures or some of the science skills. And I describe this as disciplinary knowledge. So the table just shows some examples really of what I mean by substantive knowledge and disciplinary knowledge in science, where we could use practical work to teach substantive knowledge like osmosis or electrolysis or how to separate mixtures. But we could also use practical work to teach students about observation and making predictions and how to collect data using specialist equipment and how to set up practicals using specialist equipment. And so for this, I thought that the 4K model would be really valuable, and particularly the epistemic plane, to help me explore the different knowledge code practices that teachers were kind of talking about. So the epistemic plane highlights the practice. The practice can be specialized by what they relate to and how they relate to, where the ontic is relating to the what and the discursive the how. And so the way that I thought about this was, if something has stronger ontic relations and weaker discursive, well, this is really an emphasis on designing practical work which builds students' knowledge of science. It builds their understanding of the concepts and builds their substantive knowledge. Whereas a stronger discursive relation and weaker ontic relation, it's about designing practical work to help students develop their understanding of the methods of science, the practicals, the setting up of specialist equipment. Weaker discursive and weaker ontic, it's not about knowledge at all. It's about a practical work is designed for fun or engagement or some other kind of reasons. But we've also got practical work which is designed for both. And when I talked to teachers, the vast majority of teachers said, the reason I'm designing this practical work, the reason I've included it here is to teach students the concept. I don't really care about teaching students how to draw graphs or observations or make predictions. That's secondary. I'm using this practical to teach students the scientific knowledge, the substantive knowledge. And they didn't really think about the skills that were built into the science curriculum. And so when I think about kind of ineffective practical work, lots of the research can be summarized as saying, when teachers design practical work, do students learn what the teacher actually wanted them to learn? And so for me, I know I've done loads of science practicals where I've wanted students to understand this concept of electrolysis, this substantive knowledge, or this concept of osmosis. And kids would do it, they'd be chopping up potatoes or setting up the equipment and making measurements, and they'd be doing this, they'd be engaged, they'd be working hard. And if an SLT member came to look at my lesson, they'd say, it looks fantastic. But the problem was, what students were actually learning was they were learning how to set up this specialist equipment or take measurements. And at the end of the lesson, I'd say, okay, we've all learned electrolysis, and they wouldn't have a clue what I was talking about. And this is what teachers said to me. They said, the problem with practical work is if I design it for them to learn the concept, they don't always do that. often they learn about the processes of science. So we've got this kind of code clash of ineffective practical work. So again, a value of LCT is kind of highlighting to teachers what the bad examples are, what the ineffective looks like. Got another example here of ineffective practical work. And one teacher said to me, he said, Robbie, I've got these year 7s, so age 11, and we're going to make catapults. There's our lesson. We're going to build catapults. We're going to fling things across the room. The kids are going to love it. They're going to behave well. They're excited. But what the teacher intended or what they said they intended in their design was that students would learn the laws of physics. They'd learn Newton's first, second, third law. They'd learn about energy transfer. Did they learn any of that? No, they didn't. So again, using LCT, using semantics, can we help teachers think about what effective practical work looks like? And the catapult example is kind of having students trapped or stuck in this concrete experience, this really hands-on doing practical work, but not being able to reach the kind of theoretical ideas that the teacher wanted the students to learn. So we've got this really ineffective practical work and how we can show that. So again, thinking about helping teachers understand and think about what effective practical work looks like, well, we need the design of practical work to contain these kind of key upshifts so that we can help students move from the practical work, the concrete examples of what they're doing, to learning the theoretical examples. And having that kind of highlighted to teachers, I think, would be really valuable in making practical work more effective. So I spoke to teachers about their curriculum planning materials, and they said to me, Robbie, look, curriculum planning materials are so important to me because A, they help me design the curriculum, and B, they help me think about curriculum. They help me develop my knowledge practices, my knowledge base. So one teacher said, I look at the Ofsted framework and their key language of sequencing helps me think about sequencing. They said, I can look at the Institute of Physics, these subject institutions, and they've got well-designed narratives there. And a teacher can look at those and think, I can learn from their narratives. Another teacher wanted to develop this language within their school of designing sequences. And so they developed these higher order themes. So what I'm suggesting really is that LCT has loads to offer teachers in terms of helping understand their current practices, in highlighting what bad curriculum design looks like to them, or highlighting to teachers what poor practical work is. Offers a language. It gave me a language to help chat about curriculum design with Richard. And it's a tool to support thinking to say, how could we design our curriculum more mindfully and with mastery? But the warning that speaking to Carl is definitely this idea that teachers require a different version, perhaps, of LCT than what academic researchers would require. So they probably require a less specialized version or a less in-depth or detailed version. So what I did is I kind of thought about what that might look like. And again, please feedback or critique or anything on this, but I wonder if this is a recontextualized version, which may help teachers think about active science. And if teachers wanted to do active science and they wanted to develop the cognitive component, well, they might want to use the different tools. They might want to use threshold concepts. They might want to use conceptual cross-curriculum links. Or if teachers wanted to get students more engaged in science, they wanted students to feel more involved with science, well, they could develop thematic cross-curriculum links or a science capital teaching approach. So this recontextualized version is kind of comes along from the specialization plane, but using different language that perhaps teachers might be more comfortable with, but help them consider how they could change their practices to strengthen the cognitive element or strengthen the affective element of their curriculum. When it comes to designing practical work, there's some key questions here that for teachers they might want to consider. and what form of practical work or what form of knowledge is the practical work designed to develop? Is the practical designed to emphasize this? And if it isn't designed to emphasize that knowledge, well, how could we change it? How could we design the practical work to make students learn the substantive stuff that I want them to do and not the disciplinary? Or if I want students to learn the disciplinary, how can I design practical work for that? So again, I've got a recontextualized version of the epistemic plane, where I've got substantive knowledge on the y-axis and disciplinary knowledge on the x. And sometimes, I guess teachers might want to use this to look at their practical work and think, have I got a balance? Or is all my practical work around this substantive knowledge? Or is all my practical work around disciplinary knowledge? Or is it all a mix of everything? But if I wanted a practical and I want to teach electrolysis, I want them to get the concept. Well, how do I design it better so students learn the concept? And teachers talked to me about this. They said, you know, we could use simpler equipment because electrolysis is so messy, and in the specialist equipment, we could do micro scale practicals. We could use simpler kit to help students focus on the concept and not the doing. We might want to think about where practical work is sequenced so students have the prior knowledge that's necessary. And we might want to think more carefully about how we link the concrete and the abstract. But if we want students to develop these better skills, this disciplinary knowledge, well, how do we do that? Well, we might want to teach procedures explicitly or sequence it across the year. And often practical work, sometimes teachers want to do both. And what I suggest here is that not all disciplinary knowledge needs to be taught in every practical. So we don't want to do a hypothesis, methods, data analysis for everything, but we should be really selective of where the substantive and the disciplinary can be woven together best, these knowledge and skills. And so an example of this, a teacher said, food tests. I want teachers to learn, I want students to learn the facts of food tests, starch, if I add iodine and starch is present, it goes black or blue. But I also want students to learn the methods of science. I want students to learn about categoric and continuous data. And that example of that practical really helps students understand categoric data, that it goes from orange to blue, black, and it's not continuous data. So where can we choose the right practicals and the right forms of knowledge and weave them together? Where does the knowledge and skills, where can they fit best? I'm going to finish off by just sharing that there's a few dangers of kind of what I've suggested here.
Before you do, Robbie, can I just ask, like, about, because you're suggesting that LCT could be useful for sort of PD, professional development of teachers, or teacher training. It is being used that way.
Yeah.
So I was just going to say, like, it is. So you can build, that's not, that doesn't undermine your claim. It means you can strengthen your claim by going, and we already see that, for example, in the work of Sharon Clarence or Lee's enormous course, or in Teacher Choices in Action, or the various other things that people have done with teachers. So you can draw on those. So it's like, it doesn't undermine what you're arguing. It's more kind of actually provides it with, you know, strength. You'd be able to say, and it was being done in these various domains, in these various areas at various levels, in these various ways. And the other thing I was going to suggest, which I'll send an email anyway, is that you can also draw on people like Corinne Wolf's work, where they've kind of recontextualized things like the epistemic plane into quite much simpler language when working with engineering educators. So there's a load of stuff that you can draw on to sort of really buttress those these suggestions. I think you've just frozen, Robbie. Or is it me?
Thank you, Carl. I think we just lost you at the end there.
Yeah, I thought all of you had frozen and then realized that that may be my problem. Yes, so.
So I guess what I'm suggesting is that we don't want any of this to be reductive, and that this is a guide for thinking and not a how-to guide of step by step, oh, well, let's add in threshold concepts, or let's add in a narrative, or let's do this, and it'll make my curriculum more an emphasis on knowledge and more of an emphasis on the knower. But that hopefully some of these ideas could be helpful for teachers. And yeah, absolutely. Thank you to Lee and everybody else for their fantastic work in influencing lots of the kind of things that I'm doing. So I'm going to end there. And if anybody wants to share more ideas about the work that they're doing on recontextualizing LCT for teachers, that'd be fantastic. But thank you so much for having me and for sharing your ideas and your critique and your questions. I really appreciate it.
Robbie, hi. I've so enjoyed your presentation because I think that it's very rich and there's so much to think about, especially in terms of how you're moving between so many different parts of LCT. The one thing that I think is incredibly powerful of these kind of tools, but I don't see it coming strongly through, but I think it's there implicitly in what you've presented, and that is the shifts between, so that it's not necessarily like that the curriculum is always, dominated by a knowledge code or a knower code or elite or so on, but that there's the possibility for teachers to say, I'm going to start with the knower, with something dominated by a knower code, and then I'm going to shift to the knowledge code. And I think that to me, instead of just looking at kind of boxes and categories, the shift between when is it best, when is it appropriate to base a part of the curriculum, deeply in the knowledge code or deeply in the knower code, or shift between them, or you start here, then you move to there, then you move to there, and you put it together. I think to me, that's where some of the possibilities for avoiding a reductive approach come in. So that would be my big, just something to think about. So that you're not just setting up categories, but that you're looking at the possibilities for movements between. Thanks.
I just want to add on to that to say, I think that's extraordinarily important, because what makes LCT valuable in the context of educational debates of this kind is that it doesn't fall back into the trench warfare that so many educational debates do. I really have no time for manifestos and futures and so on that then set up yet another do this or do that. And it's the universal panacea. I think that's all snake oil salesman talk. What are this? LCT is dynamic, it's fluid, and it says, and it's totally about the problem situation. So it's like, there's no answer at all. There's just a set of tools to say, what is it you want to do? And then, okay, if you want to do that, then this is how you can do it. And if you want to do this other thing, this is how you can do that thing instead. So it doesn't say this is the right way to teach. It just says, if you want to achieve those ends, these are the ways in which you can get there. And then, to provide the kind of level of respect of the autonomy and the professional abilities of teachers, and particularly because they're the ones in the classroom doing the stuff, to be able to then, decide what from this toolkit they want to do and how they can get there. So what their aims should be, what their ends are going to be, and then they can just pull on that. And so that would then be the proper professional base of a teacher, rather than just following this usual, it's this one or this one or this one, and we choose this one, and then that becomes the universal panacea, which never is, because it's just that then there's just this the pendulum swing back and forward, which adds out the CVs and the status of the intellectuals backing those positions, but does absolutely bugger all for the teachers and the students. So I think one of the things you can really push on this is that it is fluid and it is dynamic and it is totally problem-centered. It's like, what is it you want to achieve? Just as Lee said, what is it you want to achieve, teacher? And then well, if you want to do that, then you might consider using this stuff that gets you there, but still allowing that autonomy and that respect for the professional nature of teaching. You know what I mean? It's like, because teachers know their students and the context better than somebody else who's writing from a distance. And I just think that's a really powerful, for me, that's a powerful aspect of the way in which LCT deals with this sort of thing. Rant over.
Hi, Robbie. Can you hear me?
Yeah, hello.
I just think that your conclusions are very, very insightful and enlightening, especially in terms of curriculum design. I was just wondering whether, I mean, your study is dependent upon the interview data, and those who are and those who were interviewed were teachers, right? So I mean, if you could incorporate more data, for example, the data from the students and the data collected during the classroom observations, and your conclusions can be even more convincing.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. I think it's just like it's kind of an ethnographical study, ethnographical study.
Yeah.
So, Robbie, can I prompt you to? I know a little bit more about your study. Is that you might tell people about the survey, the large-scale survey, in the 2 phases of your research design. I know you've done us the honor today of encouraging us to think about and discuss the ideas that emerge from your study, but what people often concern themselves with is where does this come from? So you did a large-scale survey before the interviews. Could you say a little bit about that, because that would answer the question that Bintang has just asked.
Yes, so I did a study really to find out a little bit more about teachers' design practices, about how they thought about curriculum design, some of their attitudes towards curriculum design, to really get some of that background and to get them thinking about what active learning means to them in science and what it looks like. I think there's definitely something there that I need to go back and think about. And I think coming back to what Paul raised earlier is about how can we make these kind of underlying principles of curriculum design? How do we make them visible? And how can we look at them and see them? And I guess that's what you're alluding to, isn't it? That perhaps with the observations and talking to students, perhaps that would make it richer. So thank you. I think it's just more for me to think about, but thank you.
Robbie, did you want to tell us about that thing that Richard mentioned? Or did I just miss it?
The survey. Yeah, so I mean, so the survey was sent out to over 50 science teachers, and it just asked teachers really to give different examples of active learning, the way they used it in their classroom, what they thought about curriculum design, and what might have been important to them in curriculum design, and possibly some of the differences between things like when they used knowledge or when they emphasized interest and engagement at different points in the curriculum. So that was a little bit more background, but again, it's based around what teachers said, rather than me actually seeing what they did.
There's nothing wrong with that. I mean, like a PhD, like any study, is more about what you don't do than what you actually do. It's like being very clear about what you're not doing, because you can't do everything in a PhD. You're joining in an ongoing conversation, an ongoing discussion of the field, and people, and you kind of like just have to find your space in that ecology to contribute to that big debate. But as people say, as I said earlier on, it's just watch out for people then going, well, actually, you didn't do that. So you just have to be very careful about saying, I'm studying this. And then this study can then connect into other studies or watching them or doing surveys of the students, or doing interviews with the students, or seeing them in action, whatever it might be. It can connect with all those other things to answer other questions, but just being very careful. I always think a PhD is X number of years, 3, 4, 10, whatever it might be, years in search of the question you're answering. So the question becomes repeatedly crafted and recrafted and sometimes totally rewritten as you go along and as you get nearer. And it's only when you get to the end of the thesis that you can actually answer, the end of almost having finished the PhD writing process, that you can find the answer what it is you are asking and about what. So it's a kind of continual kind of honing down exactly about what you're looking on. So don't take any of this stuff as criticism. It's more a case of like, just be careful about what you are saying you're looking at, and connect it in with people who are looking at other things as well. And as I said, you've got all this existing research and active interventions and collaborations with teachers that you can actually draw on to buttress your claims. And Lee's point, as I said in my, I call it a rant, but I'm quite serious about this. It's a very different way of thinking, to think of an approach as a toolkit rather than as a set of guidelines. And that is empowering rather than imposing. And that's a different way of thinking. That's another contribution to this sort of debate, because it's usually, you know, trench warfare between positions. So there's sort of lots of great things there. But in terms of like, you know, your focus, you're focusing on how teachers are talking about designing their classroom curriculum and how there may be issues with that, and how you might be able to, you know, LCT might be a useful way of providing them with tools to sharpen their thinking and focus and so on. I think that's what you're saying, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and then you can say after that, you can then say, and our next step is to do this or this or this. You know?
Yeah.
Our next step is the next stage is to do the study of this or the study of that, or to try it out in this way and so on. So you can like and I meant it when I said you can draw on the work that already exists. It doesn't have to be in the literature review only. It can be right at the end where you're kind of saying, and there are studies that suggest that this could possibly be useful, and it can build on those. So yeah, there's ways of always taking these things and turning them into positives.
Yeah, I think that you've spoken about and that Lee shared about the shifts is something that I really need to emphasize a lot more in my study. So thank you for that.
Yeah, it's really important to think LCT, to think differently. It is dynamic. It is about movement, about process. It is about change. It is never about just states that stay the same. But it doesn't just do that post-structuralist thing of just, or espouse post-structuralist thing of just saying everything's changing all the time, so we can't say anything about it except that it's changing all the time. We can analyze the states through which change occurs. But if we only analyze states, then we don't get to the change bit. And that movement around is really important. The movement around, the contextual appropriateness of different kinds of strategies as well. So I think they're really key things to emphasize. Is there's a kind of different way of thinking involved in this as well.
Great. Yeah.
Does anybody else want to come in before we go? No? Okay, cool. Well, then I will say thank you very much to Robbie for leading this roundtable. It's always a courageous thing to do, although I think this is a very supportive, friendly, and smart community. So it's not as scary as it could be, but I still think it takes courage to do it, particularly when you're in the middle of doing your thesis. And thanks to everyone else for being here. That's really great. And I hope to see you all in season 2, if there is one, because it depends upon people wanting to do these things. And also get in touch with me if you do. And also, I hope to see you all in person at LCT 5 in January 2024. So please look up about that on the LCT conferences website. But thanks. Here's one of those, I find it very awkward bit, the kind of silent clappy thing, which is very very unsatisfying, but well done. The silent clappy thing. That really needs a name. Thanks very much, everybody. And I hope that you know, I see you soon, and feel free to be in touch with the forum and with other people and with myself. This is a community, and we're much stronger and smarter together.